My name is Arthur Manley, and I am 79 years old. I live in what used to be called the in-law suite, a converted garage space at the back of what was once my son's house. There is a kitchenette, a small bathroom, and a narrow bed against the window that faces the fence. So close I can see the knots in the wood and the carpenter bee-holes like old bullet wounds. Some days, the sun never even reaches my room. I sit at the table by the window and sip my tea, listening to the muffled movements of my daughter-in-law upstairs and the sound of a lawn mower from the neighbor's yard. This is what my world has become. Stillness, waiting, and the distant echo of lives I'm no longer a part of. I came here 8 years ago, after my wife Marion passed away in her sleep. It was a stroke, the doctor said, sudden and merciful. There wasn't even time to say goodbye. One moment she was complaining about the noise the garbage truck made in the morning, and the next she was gone. We'd been married 54 years. You don't simply recover from that. You adapt. You learn to move without the person who anchored your every day. That's what I tried to do. After the funeral, our son Jason suggested I move in with him and his family in Rochester. He said it would be good for the grandchildren to have their grandfather nearby and that the space over the garage could be turned into something livable. I said yes, not because I wanted to. I had no desire to be a burden, but because I couldn't stand the emptiness of the house Marion and I had shared. Every corner whispered her name. Every drawer had her handwriting on old recipe cards. The silence there was too loud. At first, I felt needed. I helped with school runs, made breakfast when Allison, my daughter-in-law, was running late, fixed the dripping tap, taught the kids, Owen and Lisa, how to ride their bikes. I planted a small garden on the side of the house with tomatoes and herbs and watched with quiet satisfaction as Owen would pick basil for his mother's spaghetti sauce. But even then, I noticed Allison's eyes rarely met mine. She was always polite, always distant. There was a way she would thank me that felt like she was closing a door. Jason, though, he made me feel like a father again. He worked as an urban planner, often late hours, but we'd sit on the porch in the evenings when he got home. He'd talk about the city's problems, the weight of balancing budgets, the joy he found in designing spaces where people could live better. I would listen, and sometimes, when the mood struck him, he would ask me what I thought. It wasn't much, but it meant the world to me. He respected me. He remembered I was more than just the old man in the back room. That, I think, is what kept me there. As the years went on, Allison's detachment grew colder. She stopped involving me in family dinners. I would hear laughter from the upstairs kitchen while I reheated soup from a can below. The grandchildren became teenagers, busy, distracted, less willing to spend time with a grandfather whose stories no longer impressed them. I don't blame them. The world changes fast, and I'm not part of the digital current they swim in, but I missed them, more than I can say. I missed their questions, their games, their noisy footsteps running down the hallway. Still, I endured. I'm a quiet man by nature. I never raised my voice in that house, never demanded anything. I paid rent, small as it was, and contributed to groceries. I kept to myself. I learned to disappear. Sometimes I think that's what old age really is, the gradual process of becoming invisible. Jason remained my anchor. No matter how much Allison pulled away, he pulled me back in. He made sure I was included in holiday plans, made the kids sit with me for at least 1 hour during Thanksgiving, bought me books he thought I'd like. He even came down one night with a glass of scotch and asked me what I missed most about Marion. I told him it was the way she touched my shoulder when she walked past me, absent-mindedly, as if reassuring herself that I was still there. He nodded, and we sat in silence. That was enough. That was love. Then, last January, everything changed. Jason was killed in a car accident on his way home from work. A delivery truck slid through an icy intersection and hit his driver's side. He died instantly. The knock on the door came at 2:18 a.m., and I answered it in my robe. Allison stood there, backlit by the porch light, white as paper. Her lips moved, but no sound came out for a long moment. Then she whispered, "It's Jason." That's all she said. And I knew. The days that followed were a blur of casseroles, phone calls, paperwork, and muted sobbing behind closed doors. I didn't sleep. I walked the halls of the house at night like a ghost. The grandchildren were shattered, Owen silent and angry, Lisa sobbing into her pillow. Allison moved like she was underwater, and I felt like someone had pulled the last nail from the frame holding up my world. I remember standing beside Jason's casket, looking at his face, pale and perfect like it was carved from cold marble. And I thought, this can't be right. I'm the one who's supposed to go first. I'm the father. This isn't the order of things. My knees gave out at the burial. I fell gracelessly, like a man without bones. Someone, maybe a neighbor, helped me up. I didn't even look at their face. After the funeral, things began to shift quickly. Allison became brisk, matter-of-fact. She started talking about financial constraints, the burden of maintaining the house, the importance of moving forward. I told her I would help in any way I could. She thanked me without looking me in the eye. She asked me to sign some paperwork. She said it was just to renew the property tax exemptions. I signed it without reading, as I had done many times before. Jason had always handled these things. I didn't imagine she would trick me. She was his wife, the mother of his children. She was family. But family, I've come to learn, is not a guarantee. It's not armor. It's not insurance against cruelty. Sometimes it's where betrayal cuts the deepest. Now I sit in this small room with peeling paint and a heater that groans at night, trying to make sense of what my life has become. I listen to the footsteps above me. I hear laughter sometimes. None of it is for me. I'm not invited. I'm tolerated. And even that, I fear, is coming to an end. There is a look in Allison's eyes now. Something final. Something calculating. Something that tells me the worst may still be ahead. And I wonder, as I stir my tea and watch the steam rise like a ghost, what will they do with me now that Jason is gone? It was a Tuesday morning in late February, gray and wet, the kind of morning that seeps into your bones and stays there. I had just finished making oatmeal, stirring it slowly with a wooden spoon, the way Marion used to do when I was sick. I still cooked as if someone else would join me at the table. Old habits. The bowl sat untouched. I wasn't hungry. I was never hungry anymore. I heard footsteps upstairs, rapid and sharp, followed by the unmistakable scrape of drawers being opened and slammed shut. Then the phone rang. Once. Twice. A pause. Then again. Then nothing. I didn't think much of it. Allison had been restless since Jason died. We all were. The grief had settled in her in a peculiar way. Not as sadness, but as a kind of mechanical urgency. She started organizing closets, rearranging furniture, repainting walls. She scrubbed things that were already clean. She moved like a woman running from something invisible. I stayed out of her way. I didn't know what else to do. That afternoon, she knocked on the door to my unit, not the way family knocks. Soft and rhythmic. But fast, efficient, 3 hard taps like she was trying to notify a tenant, not speak to a father-in-law. I opened the door. She was standing there with a man I didn't recognize. He was in his 40s, wearing a navy coat, holding a clipboard. His eyes were too friendly, like he was used to talking people into things they didn't want. "Arthur," Allison said, her voice tight. "This is Brendan Cartwright. He's a housing consultant. Can we come in?" I stepped aside, confused but not wanting to seem difficult. Brendan walked in with practiced ease, glanced around the small space, made a few notes on his clipboard, then smiled. The kind of smile you give a dog you don't plan to adopt. "We're just here to talk through some next steps," he said, like we were discussing a change in the weather. Given everything that's happened, Allison thought it would be good to assess the situation and start planning for the future. I turned to Allison, who was already seated in my chair, legs crossed, arms folded. "What situation?" I asked. "Well," she began, with a sigh that sounded rehearsed, "Jason handled everything. The mortgage, the taxes, the maintenance, and now, with him gone, it's just me. And the house is too big for us, for me and the kids. It's a lot, emotionally, financially. So, I've been exploring some options." "What options?" I said again, slower this time. Brendan chimed in. "One option is to sell the property and downsize. Another is to convert the garage suite back into usable space to increase the value of the home. Alternatively, there are some very good senior living communities in the area." Allison and I visited one just last week, a beautiful facility in Irondequoit. Independent units, medical staff on site, transportation services, community activities. I raised my hand just slightly. "Are you saying you want me to move out?" Allison's lips tightened. "I'm saying we all have to adjust. Jason's gone. Things are different now. This setup was temporary. It was never meant to be forever. But Jason isn't here anymore," she snapped, and immediately looked away, as if the words tasted wrong in her mouth. There was a long pause. Brendan tried to fill it with paper. "Here are some brochures," he said, placing a glossy folder on the table. "Take your time, no pressure. But the sooner we make decisions, the smoother the transition can be." They left not long after. Brendan shook my hand like a man congratulating me on an excellent retirement plan. Allison didn't say goodbye. I watched them walk back to the main house, the door closing with a soft finality. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floor above. I kept hearing her voice. Temporary. Never meant to be forever. The place where I had mourned my wife, helped raise my grandchildren, supported the household, now reduced to a project to be dismantled. A few days later, things accelerated. I came home from the grocery store to find the side entrance to my unit blocked with cardboard boxes. I had to move them just to get to my door. When I asked Allison about them, she said they were just donations waiting for pickup. The next morning, she sent me a text message asking if I would be willing to vacate by the end of March. It would give us time to prepare the property for listing before the spring market, she wrote. I didn't respond. Instead, I went to the filing cabinet I kept under the bed and pulled out the envelope Jason had given me 3 years prior. In it were copies of legal documents, utility bills, and a letter from a lawyer, his lawyer, outlining the details of our arrangement. Jason had insisted we make it official. "Just in case something happens," he had said. I never thought it would. Inside was a property addendum. Jason had added my name to the land deed as co-tenant. The suite I lived in was not just a borrowed space. It was mine, in legal terms. My signature was there, as was his. The document had been notarized. It was binding. I stared at it for a long time. Jason had done this to protect me. He must have known something. Sensed that Allison might not keep me around if he were gone. My heart ached thinking of him, of how even in death he had tried to take care of me. But it also hurt to know how quickly Allison had tried to erase me, Barely 6 weeks had passed since Jason's funeral, and she was already drawing lines in the sand, redrawing the borders of her new streamlined life, one that no longer had space for the old man in the back room. A few days later, she texted me again, this time with a link to a senior community website and the message, "They have availability. I can schedule a tour." I didn't reply. Instead, I made an appointment with a lawyer. The following weeks passed under a heavy, disquieting stillness that settled over the house like early winter fog. I kept to my little annex more than usual, not out of choice but instinct, the same instinct that warns a deer when it's being stalked. The air inside the house was charged with a kind of ambient tension, like the air before a thunderstorm, thick and electric. Allison was no longer pretending to be cordial. Her tone, whenever we spoke, which became less and less frequent, had taken on a managerial detachment. Her eyes slid over me, not resting as if I were some object too large to throw away, but too old to be of use. The children barely came down to see me. Owen and Lisa had retreated into their rooms and their routines, and I didn't blame them. They were grieving too, and grief can make children retreat in ways that look like indifference. The finality of Jason's absence had begun to reveal itself not just in emotion, but in administration. Letters started arriving addressed only to Allison. Bills with new routing numbers, notifications from insurance companies. I was no longer CC'd on anything, even those that pertained to shared expenses in the house. I overheard her one day on the phone with the electric company, telling them to consolidate accounts and remove the sub-meter. It was small, but significant. That meter had been installed specifically for my space, so that Jason and I could fairly split utilities. Removing it was a symbolic act, a quiet erasure. Then came the afternoon I came home and found the locks changed. It was a rainy Thursday. I had gone to the corner pharmacy to refill a prescription and stopped by the library to return a few books. I arrived back at the side door, the one that led directly into my unit, and inserted my key. It didn't turn. At first I thought I'd made a mistake, maybe grabbed the wrong key off the ring. I tried again, still no give. Confused, I knocked on the main door. Allison answered in workout leggings, earbuds still in, a thin layer of sweat on her temples. She looked annoyed before she even registered it was me. "The lock?" I asked. "Oh," she said casually. "Yeah. We had to rekey everything. Security concerns." "Security?" I repeated, blinking. "There have been break-ins in the neighborhood." "I meant to tell you. I'll get you a new copy. I just haven't had a chance." I stood there in the rain, holding my canvas tote bag filled with borrowed books and pharmacy items, feeling a rush of helplessness so deep it startled me. Something inside me, a long dormant pride or self-respect, flared weakly, but I swallowed it down. I didn't want to fight on the front porch like a disgruntled tenant. I simply nodded, stepping back. She didn't offer to let me in through the main house. She closed the door gently, but firmly. It took 2 days before I received the new key. It was handed to me by Lisa, awkwardly, as if she had been told not to make eye contact. I thanked her anyway, trying to inject some warmth into the moment, but she was already halfway back to the stairs. I stood there, key in hand, wondering what she had been told about me. That weekend, I overheard Allison talking to someone on the phone in the backyard. I was sitting near the open window of my unit, not eavesdropping, but simply unable to avoid her voice drifting over. Her tone was tight and frustrated. "No, I don't know what else to do," she was saying. "He's not leaving. I've tried to be nice. I've offered him places. He just keeps ignoring me. And the house is bleeding money. I can't list it while he's still here. He's 79. How much longer can this really go on?" I felt those words. Not just heard them, but felt them, like a door slamming inside my chest. How much longer can this go on? I wasn't even a person anymore, not really. I was a delay, a liability, a logistical issue standing between her and whatever fresh start she imagined for herself. I spent that night rereading the property documents. Jason's name. My name. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. It was all there, in black and white. But something told me legal clarity wouldn't be enough. People like Allison didn't operate on what was right. They operated on what they could get away with. And she, clearly, believed she could get away with a lot. The next escalation was subtle, but unmistakable. One morning I opened the refrigerator and found half of my food missing. The milk was gone. My cheese. The small jar of strawberry preserves Marion used to buy. The kind I had to drive across town to find. At first, I thought I had misplaced things. Then I found a note on the counter written in Allison's handwriting that read, "Please don't overstock the fridge. We're trying to keep things simple." It was insulting in its condescension, like she was talking to a confused elder who'd hoarded canned peaches in the Depression. I didn't reply. Instead, I went and bought a compact mini-fridge, plugged it in beside my bed, and moved what little I had into it. When Allison saw it through the open door, she didn't say a word. But that evening, the Wi-Fi went out. Just for me. My unit, once connected to the house's internet, now showed no network available. I asked Owen about it. He shrugged, said maybe the router needed to be reset. But I knew. And the fact that I knew, and she knew I knew, was the worst part. It wasn't overt cruelty. It was systemic dismantling. She was unbuilding my place in this house, one connection at a time. A week later, I found a letter on my doorstep. Not a text, not an email. A printed letter in a plain envelope. It was from a law firm, not Jason's. Her new one. It stated in dry clinical language that Allison Hollis, now sole head of household, intended to pursue a legal eviction if I did not voluntarily vacate the premises by April 15th. The letter claimed that my occupancy was not supported by enforceable lease terms, and that, given the absence of a rental agreement and the change in household circumstances, my continued stay was no longer viable. I sat at the table, letter in hand, unable to breathe for a moment. The walls of my little space, which once felt like a quiet refuge, now pressed inward like a cell. I realized then what Allison was doing. She was counting on my silence, on my reluctance to fight, on my fear of confrontation. She was trying to erase me quietly, with paper and politeness, hoping I would just vanish like an old photograph turned face down on a mantel. But I wouldn't vanish. Not this time. I took the letter and walked straight to the file cabinet where I kept the deed. It was buried beneath years of accumulated papers, utility bills, tax records, faded photographs, and cards from birthdays long since past. My hands trembled as I pulled out the envelope Jason had given me 3 years earlier, his name written on the front in his blocky, deliberate handwriting. Dad, keep this. I remembered the day he handed it to me. We had just finished clearing the gutters together, and he sat me down with 2 beers and said, "I just want to make sure everything is clear. Not because I expect anything to happen, but, just in case." He smiled as he said it. I remember wanting to laugh it off, tell him he was being morbid, but he looked so earnest, so determined to take care of me, that I nodded and told him I'd keep it safe. Now, that simple act of foresight, that brief moment of father-son concern, had become the last thread holding me together. Inside were the notarized documents confirming that I was co-owner of the property. Jason had placed my name on the deed as a joint tenant, which meant that upon his death I had full legal rights to remain. Not a guest, not a tenant, a rightful owner. I read through the paperwork 3 times to be sure. There was no ambiguity, no loophole. Jason had protected me, even in death. The irony was unbearable. He had trusted his wife, assumed she would honor what he'd set in place. But Allison wasn't honoring anything. She was trying to erase not just my presence, but the last meaningful decision Jason had made. The next day, I visited an attorney, a man named Richard Morrow, recommended by an old friend from the Veterans Center. He was quiet, direct, and spoke like someone who had spent a lot of time watching people try to twist the law to their advantage. I laid everything on his desk: the letter from Allison's lawyer, the deed, Jason's notes, even the utility bills with both our names. Richard read in silence, occasionally scribbling something in the margin. When he finally looked up, his face was calm, but his voice was edged with something I hadn't heard in a long time. Righteous anger. "This letter is bluster," he said. "You're not a tenant. You're a legal owner. What she's doing, trying to evict you, isn't just morally obscene. It's legally impossible without a court battle. And even then, she'd lose. Unless..." He trailed off. "Unless what?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands. "Unless she tries to have you declared legally incapacitated. That's the only angle she might pursue. If she can claim you're not of sound mind, she could petition for guardianship and attempt to assume control of your share of the property." The thought made me cold. "She'd do that?" "I've seen it before," he said. "It's not common, but it's effective if no one pushes back, especially if the person in question is elderly and isolated." I nodded slowly. The pieces began to shift in my mind like parts of a puzzle that suddenly snapped into place. The missing food, the Wi-Fi cut, the changed locks, the subtle gaslighting, the suggestions that I was forgetting things. It wasn't just cruelty. It was a campaign. She was building a case. She was painting a portrait of a confused, deteriorating old man who couldn't be trusted to manage his own affairs. She wanted not just the house, but control over me, my finances, my decisions, my freedom. But Jason had given me more than just documents. He had given me evidence, and I would not go quietly. Richard and I began building a response. He helped me file a notice of legal opposition to any eviction proceedings and prepared a formal letter to Allison's lawyer outlining the deed status. He also scheduled an independent mental competency assessment through a respected local clinic. "You're sharp," he said to me, "but it's better to have paperwork that proves it." The assessment took place over 2 sessions. They made me draw clocks, remember lists, recount current events, answer questions about my finances, health, medications. I passed easily, but the experience was deeply humiliating. Sitting in a fluorescent-lit room with a clipboard-wielding stranger asking if I remembered who the president was, I felt like a student back in school. Only this time, failure would cost me my life. The report came back. Mr. Arthur Manley displays no signs of cognitive impairment. He is alert, oriented, and capable of independent living. I held the paper in my hands like a passport, like a shield. I had it notarized, copied, and filed. By this point, Allison had stopped speaking to me entirely. We moved like shadows around each other. She entered the kitchen through the front door. I used the back entrance to avoid crossing paths. The children didn't speak to me anymore. Whether they had been told I was losing my mind or simply no longer knew how to look me in the eye, I couldn't tell. It was as if I had died with Jason, and all that remained was a whisper of obligation none of them knew how to handle. Then, one evening, something changed. I was returning from a walk around the block, a slow ritual I'd started taking up again, just to keep my legs moving, when I noticed the side gate to the backyard open. I walked around to close it and saw a man, tall, well-dressed, early 40s, standing with Allison on the patio, pointing toward the house. He was holding a clipboard. Not Brendan, the housing consultant. Someone new. I stepped back behind the fence, listening. The man was speaking quietly, but I caught a few phrases. Comparative pricing, property division, buyout potential. She was getting an appraisal. She wasn't just kicking me out. She was preparing to sell the house entirely. That night I sat at the kitchen table with all the paperwork spread before me, my hands clenched around a cup of tea gone cold. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't grief. It was strategy. Calculated. Unforgivable. And yet, as I sat there, I wasn't angry. I was focused. I had the documents. I had the proof of ownership. I had the mental assessment. I had the lawyer. I had, for the first time in a long while, a plan. And more than that, I had resolve. Allison thought she could dismantle me. Jason thought he had to protect me. But neither of them knew what I was truly capable of when cornered. I'd lost my wife. I'd lost my son, but I still had myself. And I would not, could not, lose that. Not without a fight. I pulled the letter from the lawyer and walked straight to the filing cabinet in my makeshift annex, the one filled with old photographs, tax statements in Marion's handwriting, invoices for groceries, and greeting cards from birthdays long ago. My fingers trembled as I extracted the envelope Jason had given me years ago. The one he had pressed into my hand after we'd trimmed the overgrown wisteria together. The handwriting on the front said simply, "Dad, just in case." I remembered how I'd thanked him and told him he was being overly cautious. He had smiled gently, confident that I understood. Now, that envelope felt like a lifeline. Inside were the notarized documents that named me as a joint owner of the property, a tenant in common with the right of survivorship. I wasn't a guest. I was not just living there out of kindness. I had every legal right to be in that annex. I read the words again and again, rechecking the signatures, the notary stamp, the deed. It was all unmistakable. His thoughtful foresight had become my strongest defense. The next day, I arranged to meet with an elderly lawyer named Richard Morrow, someone my old friend from the Veterans Center assured me was trustworthy. He sat behind his desk, the room dim and quiet, with certificates and briefcases lining the walls. When I handed him the documents, his face remained impassive, but I felt something shift in the air between us. He read in silence, fingers tapping lightly on the paperwork, then looked up and said, "This letter is posturing, a bluff at best. You're a legal co-owner. She has no standing to evict you." He leaned forward. "Unless she goes the route of claiming you're no longer mentally capable and petitions for guardianship or conservatorship." The very possibility unsettled me. To be declared incompetent felt like I'd already been erased. But Richard, calm and direct, laid out the defenses. We filed a formal notice contesting any eviction action and drafted a letter to her lawyer, reaffirming my ownership. Then he recommended a medical assessment to prove my mental fitness. "I don't want your eyes watering when they ask if you know the date," he said softly, "but I want you legally bulletproof." The assessment was humiliating. Imagine an 80-year-old man sitting under bright lights, the walls barren, being tested like a child, asked to recall recent headlines, count backwards, draw clocks. My pulse thundered as I tried to ignore how ridiculous it all felt. But I passed. The report, official, clinical, declared that I was lucid, oriented, fully capable of managing my affairs. It became my second anchor, next to the deed. Back home, the house had turned eerily silent. Allison's avoidance was total. We passed each other like polite apparitions. The children didn't say a word. It was as though grief had made them mute, as though my presence caused them discomfort or shame. But I was no ghost. I had documents. I had competence. And most of all, I still had reverence for Jason's memory and the clarity of what was right. Then, one afternoon, I noticed a different man arriving at the house, tall, dressed sharply in a blazer, holding a clipboard with papers that looked like blueprints. I stayed behind the screen of the wooden fence and watched as he and Allison whispered on the patio, pointing toward windows, murmuring about property value, market comparables, buyout offers. She was soliciting appraisals. She wasn't just making me leave. She was planning to seize everything. That night I spread everything across the kitchen table. The deeds, the medical report, our filings, even old pictures of Jason smiling as he planted basil with Owen. My chest felt heavy, but clarity settled in. This was deliberate, and I had the means to stand firm. I wouldn't vanish. I wouldn't be erased. I had a lawyer. I had proof. And for the first time since losing both Marion and Jason, I felt edge. I felt alive. The morning of the hearing broke with a low ceiling of cloud that made the street lamps look reluctant to go dark, and I walked up the courthouse steps with Richard at my shoulder, the two of us moving slowly because my knee complained on the higher. Rises, and because there is a kind of gravity to days when the balance of your life is about to be weighed by strangers. Inside, the corridors smelled of paper and aftershave, and the particular dust of public buildings, and I could feel my pulse in my jaw as we found the right door and sat behind a row of people who looked like they wished they were anywhere else. Allison arrived 10 minutes later in a slate dress that made her look as if she had rehearsed grief into armor, followed by a brisk man with a tablet who did not bother to hide his annoyance when he saw Richard hand me a folder thick with copies of the deed, the assessment, and the letters Jason had signed. She did not look at me, which was a mercy, because if she had, I might have remembered her as the woman who once asked me to show Owen how to fix a bicycle chain and thanked me with a pie still warm from the oven. And I needed to hold on to the version of her who had changed the locks and starved my little refrigerator on purpose, because it is easier to withstand a storm if you stop pretending it is rain. When our case was called and we stood at the front, I felt something curious happen, a quieting inside me, the way the world narrows for a second before a roller coaster tips forward, and then I listened as the attorneys did their ritual. Names and filings and preliminary objections, the legal language like chess openings they could make in their sleep. Allison's lawyer went first, voice smooth as oiled wood, describing a vulnerable household, a widow with 2 teenagers and an aging father-in-law whose forgetfulness had grown alarming, whose confusion had led to dangerous incidents, whose occupancy was never intended to be permanent, and whose continued presence presented a hardship so acute that relief was not merely reasonable but necessary. He used phrases that felt designed to sound like compassion while carrying the heft of expulsion. He spoke about safety and stability and the best interests of minors, and when the judge asked for specifics, he produced affidavits from a neighbor who claimed I had left the stove on, from a handyman who said I had failed to recognize him twice, from a primary care office that had no recent records because I had not seen a doctor in a year, which he framed as neglect rather than a stubborn old man's desire to avoid waiting rooms. It was efficient and polished and wrong in a way that made my molars ache. Richard did not hurry. He unzipped his old leather portfolio and laid out our papers like a carpenter setting tools, and when he spoke, he kept his voice low enough that everyone else had to lean forward a fraction, which is a kind of power too. He began, not with the affidavits, but with the deed, the notarized instrument that bore Jason's full signature and mine, the joint tenancy language plain enough for the cleaning crew to understand. And he said that grief cannot cancel a deed any more than weather can unsign a check. He offered the competency evaluation from the clinic, signed by a neurologist with a neat slanted hand, which established not merely that I knew the date and the name of the governor, but that I could manage my finances and understand the nature of legal proceedings, and then he produced the letter Allison's counsel had sent threatening eviction, as if I were a month-to-month occupant in a spare bedroom. and the judge's mouth tightened in a way I recognized from my teaching days, whenever a student tried to pass off laziness as creativity. Richard did not stop there. He submitted the email Allison had sent to a realtor promising a vacant property by summer and a preliminary memorandum of sale to a developer contingent upon clear title, which in our circumstance could only be offered by erasing me, and he let the implication breathe in the room that this was not about safety or confusion, but about speed and profit, about a woman who had stepped so quickly over the fresh dirt of her husband's grave that she'd tracked it into the bank. The judge asked me 2 questions, and I answered them without looking at Allison because I did not want to see what my steadiness would do to her face. He asked where I kept my important documents, and I said I kept them in a metal file box under the bed where Marian's quilt still lay folded at the foot. And he asked what I understood about my rights to the annex, and I said that my son had placed my name on the deed so that I would be safe in the one place where his children could still find a piece of him, and that I had no wish to cause hardship to anyone, but that I would not be swept out of my life like dust from under a couch. The judge nodded, made a note, asked Allison's counsel whether there was any legal authority to support an eviction of a co-owner who had been found competent, listened to a strained answer that sounded like a ladder wobbling on uneven ground, and then ruled from the bench in a voice that was careful and final. He denied the eviction petition, entered an order enjoining any attempt to alter utilities or access to my annex, recognized the validity of the deed, and set a separate hearing on the question of partition should either owner seek to force a sale, which was his way of saying that if they wanted out, they could ask the law for a fair division instead of trying to smoke me out with inconvenience. He also referred the matter of the affidavits to Chambers, which I suspected meant someone would take a quiet look at the neighbor who had never once carried my groceries but claimed to have seen me setting the house on fire with a kettle. There was a silence after the gavel that did not feel like victory so much as the sudden absence of a headache. And then the air filled with the small sounds of papers being gathered and bags being zipped and people realizing they had to go back to work. Allison made for the hallway in a stiff line, but the door opened slowly and caught the heel of her shoe, and for a moment she was stuck, a tableau of a person trapped by her own haste. I did not move to help, not out of cruelty, but because I had spent a year learning that you cannot save someone who believes stepping on you is the floor. In the hallway, she spun and faced me, and all the polish washed off her at once. Her mouth trembled and her eyes flared, and she said in a voice that was close to a whisper that I was ruining her life, and that Jason would be ashamed of me, and I felt the words strike like cold water and pass through, because shame is a thing you feel when you have done wrong on purpose. And what I had done was stand in the space my son had made for me and refuse to be unmade. Richard touched my elbow and steered me away before the argument could grow teeth, and we walked down the broad stairs into a light that had remembered how to be generous, and on the sidewalk he stopped and told me that this was the turn, the place. In a story where the character with everything to lose discovers he can make choices that do not require permission. He said we could file for partition by sale if I wanted clean edges, that the court would appoint a referee to oversee it, that the house could be sold on a schedule that honored reality rather than rage, that we could enroll a title company that would not blink at pressure, and that we already had a buyer who had sent word through Veronica he would stand by his offer if the legal fog cleared. I asked him if doing this would make me the villain in my grandchildren's version of events, and he said that children revise their stories as they learn the facts and as they encounter kindness that doesn't perform for an audience, and that the only thing worse than being called a villain by people you love is agreeing to live like a ghost to avoid the name. That afternoon I went home and unlocked my door with a key that no longer felt like a temporary kindness, but like part of my hand, and I sat at my table and wrote a letter I had not wanted to write. A letter to Owen and Lisa that did not disparage their mother and did not defend me as if I were on trial, but that told them the truth a way their father would have recognized, line by line and without heat, about the deed and the assessment and the judge, about the fact that love does not mean surrendering your dignity to preserve someone else's convenience, and about the simple promise that my door would remain open to them even if the rest of the house changed locks again. I left the letter where they would find it, and then I did the one practical thing that felt like ceremony. I brewed tea in Marion's chipped blue pot, carried the cup to the window, and drank it slowly while the late sun stretched a pale ribbon across the fence. The climax did not announce itself with sirens or signatures, but with the small steadying of my breath and the knowledge that the tide had turned and was now moving with me instead of against me. 2 days later, Allison's lawyer sent a proposal for a buyout that valued the annex as a shed and my share as a rounding error. And Richard sent back a petition for partition that did the arithmetic in daylight and asked the court to appoint a referee, and Veronica texted to say the buyer's finance was lined up and he did not mind waiting through the formalities, and the utilities flickered back to life in my unit as if a wire somewhere had remembered who paid for it. That evening, I heard Allison crying upstairs, and I sat very still and let the sound move through me without rushing to solve it, because there is a difference between mercy and surrender. And at last I knew which one my son had meant when he wrote my name on the deed. The sale went through faster than I had expected, and when the funds finally cleared into my account, I sat in silence for a long time staring at the balance. Not with joy, not with triumph, but with something quieter and harder to describe. Something like the steadying of breath after years of holding it in. $300,000. That was the sum of all the humiliations, the betrayals, the lies, and the counterblows I had endured. Yet to me, it felt less like a prize than like a key, a chance to lock the door on a chapter that had nearly erased me. I didn't rush to spend it. I didn't run to buy anything grand or new. I simply left it where it was, as proof that I still had choices, that I still had a future that no one else could sign away. Life in the new apartment began to find a rhythm of its own. The neighbors were mostly elderly couples and widows who lived quietly, tending to their plants, walking to the park, or sitting in the common courtyard with crossword puzzles and thermoses of coffee. They didn't ask about my past, and I didn't offer it. To them, I was simply Arthur, a widower who had recently moved across town. For the first time in years, I felt no need to explain myself, no need to justify why I lived alone or why I no longer spoke to my family. It was a kind of anonymity that felt like freedom. Sometimes, late in the evenings, I would sit by the lake behind the complex and think about Jason. I would imagine him standing there beside me, shaking his head at the way things had unraveled, but also smiling faintly because his decision to put my name on that deed had turned out to be the thread that saved me. His foresight, his simple act of love, had given me the strength to withstand the storm Allison had tried to unleash. I whispered my thanks to him more than once, to the night sky, to the water that reflected the stars. Perhaps he heard me. Perhaps not. But saying it made me feel less alone. As for Allison, I never heard from her again after that final confrontation in the cafe. Not a phone call, not a letter, not even a venomous message through a lawyer. Silence. I imagine she and the children moved into a smaller house, perhaps in another neighborhood, perhaps in another city altogether. I sometimes wonder what Owen and Lisa were told about me, what story their mother spun about the grandfather who suddenly disappeared from their lives. Maybe she painted me as the stubborn, confused old man who made things difficult. Maybe she told them I had betrayed them. Or maybe, one day, they will stumble across the truth in a file or a whispered memory and realize that their father had tried to protect me, and I had only tried to hold on to that protection. I no longer check for their names on social media, no longer linger by the phone hoping for a call on Christmas. That hope, painful as it was, has been put to rest. In its place, there is a different kind of peace. Not the peace of reconciliation, but the peace of release. I cannot make them see me. I cannot force them to love me. But I can choose not to let their rejection define the remainder of my years. There are days when loneliness weighs on me. Yes, mornings when the silence feels too sharp, when I catch myself setting out 2 cups of tea before remembering there is only me. On those days, I remind myself that solitude is not the same as defeat. I open the window, let in the air, and tell myself that survival, in the face of betrayal, is its own quiet victory. I have begun to give away small sums anonymously. A scholarship fund at the local community college, a donation to the Veterans Center, a check for the children's library, where Jason once volunteered on weekends. No one knows it is me, and that is the way I prefer it. In giving quietly, I feel something close to redemption, a way of turning all the bitterness into something that outlives me. Perhaps one day, Owen or Lisa will benefit from it without even realizing it, and that thought brings me a peculiar kind of comfort. I'm not naive. I know that age will have the last word, and that my time is shorter now than ever. But I also know that the end will not find me helpless in some institution chosen by those who wished me gone. It will find me in my own chair, by my own window, looking out at the lake as the light shifts across the water. It will find me with dignity intact, with my story untold to all but those who are willing to listen, with the knowledge that I did not allow cruelty to write the final line of my life. So when I think of Allison now, when I picture her face tight with anger, her voice rising with accusations, I do not feel rage anymore. I feel distance. I feel the sharp edge of betrayal dulled by the simple fact that I survived it. She tried to erase me. Instead, I erased the hold she had over me, and in that there is justice. Not loud, not vengeful, but silent, enduring justice. That is my ending. Not the one I had wanted, not the one Marion would have dreamed of, but the one that remains true. I walk into my final years carrying not their approval, not their affection, but something far sturdier. My own self-respect, unbroken at last.